Passover. Is it hours of starvation while we hear texts read in a language that we barely understand? Or is it a time to change everything about our lives?
Romemu, Romemu, Adonai Eloheinu, Romemu, Romemu.
Bruchim Abiyim, I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi, and you have found Beit Virtuali. Got into a lovely discussion at an adult education class some years ago. It was around Passover, and I was talking about our obligation to interpret Torah, to interpret our tradition in multiple modalities. And I talked about the Pardes model, which lots of videos on this channel already that describe that, and to look at texts for what they clearly say, for what they hint at, for what they symbolize, for how we can pull them into the present allegorically, their mystical underlying connective tissue. And the discussion with someone saying, yes, but those texts weren't written like that. That's you with all of your tools of modernity and post-modernity. It's simply sophistry. And ignoring for a second that Jewish hermeneutics has had a complex system of interpretation for literally thousands of years, and that I'm certainly not strictly using tools of the last 200 years or even the last several generations as I attempt to say that we not only can, but should and are obligated to translate and to interpret Torah in a multiplicity of modalities. As we get close to Passover, we have in the Haggadah, which has been roughly its present form for about 1,000 years, and in 80 to 90% of its present form for over 1,700 years. So not exactly a new text, not exactly new tools to bring into the interpretive trade. But one of the great passages that says clearly that this idea of interpretation and bringing things into a meaningful present has been there for a very long time, is right smack dab in the middle of the Haggadah. Right towards the end of the Magid, we read, B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. In every generation, it is one's duty to regard themselves as though they themselves personally had gone out of Egypt. Kind of hard to say that our ancestors have just been literalists and fundamentalists for the entire history, and then we got clever in the last few generations. This text, a very old text, is showing that the interpretive process of Judaism is there from the very beginning. We are required to look at the symbolism in the Torah of us coming out of Egypt, the exodus from Egypt, Yetziat Mitzrayim. We are obligated, b'chol dor v'dor chayav, obligation, to do this. It's not just that we can interpret, we must interpret. It is a mitzvah, it is part of a central obligation. I have just enough humility to know that I'm not right all the time. As a matter of fact, probably seldom right in the larger scheme of things. But that was an argument I won, and that's an argument I will win every time. We must interpret, and we must interpret Torah at the very least as if it's happening to us right now, which means we are obligated to pull Torah into our present. And what does that look like? So this is part of the iterative process of Judaism series of videos. Iterative process means that, well, it's like the scientific method. I know, strange, but bear with me. Iterative processes mean that we don't assume that we have the final right answer. It is a continually open question that we repeat over and over and over and over again. Within science, hopefully to get closer and closer to a provable truth that can be shown to have the same answers by multiple people testing the same hypothesis. Within Judaism, it is that we keep on reading the same stories over and over again because they have the ability to be brought into the present, because they are so archetypal. They have so much truth within them that we have the ability to apply them to life today, even though life in the Torah was radically different than anything that we could possibly understand today. So it's not arbitrary, it's not silly ritual. All Jewish holidays, as well as all Jewish texts, especially the Torah, just as much the Talmud though, truly, are texts that we can find ourselves within every year, because as our sophistication with reading the text grows, so do we change, so do we encounter new situations, and as we read the same texts, we realize that they are telling us something completely different. And so the iterative process of Passover is, what questions do we ask each year, and what actions come from asking those questions, so that when we ask the same questions the year after, we get different answers. And so that when we have applied actions from the truths that come out from our questions, that we must do new things. And in the process of doing that, we slowly elevate ourselves. We elevate each other. And indeed, the key to the iterative process of Passover is this passage that I just opened up, Bechol Dor Vador. And there are two parts. The first part is the question that must be asked, Bechol Dor Vador. You must see yourself in every generation as if you yourself are coming out of Egypt. Well, Egypt, Mitzrayim, means the narrow places. Remember, we are not obligated to only see this as literal. Most of us have never been to Egypt, so therefore it must be seen as a metaphor. And so the idea of slavery and coming out of slavery as a metaphor are what are the moments of oppression that we are in the process of coming out of or have come out of. That's the series of questions. We'll get back to that in a second. The second part is so critical, and it's about narrative and how we actually explain our narratives, because and I looked through a variety of Haggadot on my way to preparing for this video, and I found that a lot of more recent versions of the Haggadot use that part of the Bechol Dor Vador, but they cut out the rest. Maybe they have the second part, but the third part is almost always cut out unless you read a traditional text, and only the three parts taken together will truly give us a full meaning. So I want to start with the second and third part, then we'll get back to the first. And the second part is something poetically that we see throughout Jewish tradition, that we see a statement, Bechol Dor Vador, and the statement is backed up by a proof text. And that's what happens here. The proof text is from Exodus 13:8, and it reads, Shnei Amar, as it is written, Vehigadta levinecha biyom hahu lemor ba'voze asa Adonai li b'tzeiti mi Mitzrayim. So, you shall tell your child on that day, it was because of this that the Eternal did for me when I went out of Egypt. So the first part is the obligation of interpretation, but the second part is the obligation of narrative. How are we supposed to speak of our life experiences? What is Judaism suggesting is the most efficacious way for us to integrate ourselves into the narrative of Judaism? And once again, looking at the more metaphorical meaning of these words. Hopefully this is not the first time you're watching a beitvirtuali video, but if so, go back, watch my name game videos, especially the name game part 2, where I talk about Yud-He Vav-He, the proper name of the Eternal in the Torah, being a variation of the verb to be, liot in Hebrew. So therefore, whenever we encounter the name of God, it's not a name like a person, it's not Bob, it's not Jane, it is something elevated, it is an aspect of existence. And so this part of Bechol Dor Vador is saying, when you are talking about how your life has gone, especially to those who have the most to learn from you, as you teach your children about what's happened on your life, you say, my life, the existence of my life includes all these ways that I have come out of my narrow places. Or differently phrased, I am going to tell my children, I'm going to tell the people that learn from me about every way that I have overcome. The text here does not say that my narrative is every way that I am currently suffering. And if that is a contradiction to certain things that exist in popular culture today, then so be it. The Jewish tradition is suggesting very clearly that our story, our narrative, how we explain ourselves to someone else is the act of overcoming, not to dwell in the things that were overcome themselves. We talk about moving away from. We don't talk about the suffering itself. We might need to deal with the suffering. That might be what we need to do therapeutically. But when we talk, when we pass on our narrative is about how we came out of Egypt, how we ourselves, in our lives, in our existence, were part of a process of overcoming. And the iterative process of that is every single year, we look at how are we explaining our life. Am I explaining my life only in everything that's going wrong with me right now? It's tempting to do. You're going to get a lot more clicks and likes on a video like this if I'm telling you to do that. I promise you. But Jewish tradition is saying, no, this is actually how we explain our existence. And the third part is a why. Not only a why, but a profound why, as here's a rabbi online right now, and there are still Jews in the world, and Judaism should not exist according to all rules of how religions pass away. And the third part of this text says, Lo et avotenu bilvad ga'al hakadosh baruch hu, ela af otanu ga'al imahem. It was not only our ancestors, whom the Holy Blessed One of being redeemed from slavery, we too were redeemed with them, as it is written. Pay attention, yet another proof text here, this one from Deuteronomy 6:23. Shnei Amar, as it is written, Ve'otanu hotzi misham lematan havi otanu letet lanu et ha'aretz asher nishba la'avotenu. The Eternal brought us out from there, so that the Eternal might take us to the land which the Eternal had promised to our fathers. So we start with the individual narrative. This is how I have come out because I'm part of the we, because we are constantly in the process of overcoming the things that have tried to keep us down. Has anything ever tried to keep the Jews down in history? Yeah. How have we survived? By focusing on the very process of survival itself. Our narrative is not that we are slaves. Our narrative is that we were slaves. Our narrative is not the suffering of slavery. Our narrative is that we came out of that suffering. Which brings us back to the first part in the iterative questions. Bechol dor v'dor chayav. In every generation, we are required to understand this beautiful metaphor of coming out of slavery as if we ourselves are coming out of slavery. Well, it has to be a metaphor. Unless we are in literal slavery in literal Egypt right now, this must be a metaphor. So what are the metaphors of slavery and what are the metaphors of Egypt? And the most obvious one, and the one that anyone who's been in my congregations has heard year after year, the most obvious one is addiction. Now, test yourself right now in this conversation about addiction. When I said the word addiction, what was the first type of addiction that came to mind? I mean it, seriously. Test yourself on this, okay? Most likely, depending on where you are, the most common one is going to be either alcohol or opiates. Alcohol because it's the most common one that we see around us, and opiates because it is a scourge, especially in the United States right now, with more overdose deaths than we can possibly imagine. But here's why this test is so important. I said addiction. I didn't say substance addiction. Obviously, if our lives are being ruled by a substance, there are many levels to that. And part of the getting healing, you cannot go and do anything about addiction unless you realize you have addiction. And the hidden part of that is not only recognizing, but also have something to live for beyond the addiction. And the reason we try to calm our internal voices and drown them out with substances over and over again is because we don't want to face ourselves. And that's a longer video for a different day. But this point about what we visualized with addiction, well, I worked as a project manager in corporate America for just under 15 years in the 90s and the aughts. And the addiction of my generation, as well as the generation that preceded me, possibly less so, especially after the age of COVID, the generations following me, is the addiction of workaholism. And I know it's an addiction because I know people that have died from it. I've seen people who, well, seriously, if we're bragging about, hey, look at me, I'm so awesome, I work 100 hours a week, I never see my family, and I haven't taken a vacation in 10 years, that's an addiction. And yeah, we can say, well, that's my choice and that's how I get ahead. Fine, but recognize it for what it is. And we can go down the line. Anything where we are absolutely required by our own personal choices or inclinations to do something without that thing, we cannot live, we cannot move forward, we cannot exist. That is a narrow place. That's a mitzrayim. That's an addiction. So the first question, once we get beyond that addiction is only alcohol or only opiates, is to be able to honestly say, what am I addicted to? Am I addicted to getting acknowledgement online? One of the great addictions of Gen Z and millennials is the absolute need to have a like after a post. And before anyone thinks that this is this old gray-haired stupid guy, this has been shown scientifically over and over again. Even the companies that are hosting this very video right now have it in there that especially on teenage girls, this releases dopamine in the same way that opiates do. I think that there's very few 11 and 12-year-olds on the face of this planet that would premeditate, oh, let's go ahead and become addicted to opiates. But yet, we make these accounts that have the exact same effect on the brain, and the depression that comes from not getting enough likes is the same sort of down that then requires the next needle, in this case, the next post, to hopefully I get more likes next time. Addiction is complicated. This is why, behold, dor v'dor, we are required in every generation because we are all addicted to something. The iterative process of Judaism is, are we willing to ask ourselves that question at least once a year and then do something about it? You see, what's fascinating about Passover is it takes place in the month of Nisan. That's month number 1 on the Jewish calendar, right? New Year, or the way that we usually celebrate New Year, Rosh Hashanah, is on the 7th month. That is the celebration of the New Year of the world, but the first of Nisan is the New Year of the Kings. So in other words, it's the earthly celebration, our processes, our human processes. So in our iterative process, the first question we ask ourselves, that everything that follows from the questions of Shavuot, the counting of the Omer in between there, the iterative questions of Tisha B'Av, the iterative questions of each of the fasts before that, the iterative questions around the high holidays, all of these come from this first question. What are the things that are keeping us down right now? What are the metaphorical slaveries in our lives? And if we're not willing to ask those questions, no other answers will be forthcoming as we ask our iterative questions with our next holidays. So this is the moment right now. We are all in the midst of at least an addiction. We are addicted to something. The only acceptable addiction is being addicted to my videos. Obviously kidding, but we are. How many of us are addicted to power cycling through series on Netflix or whatever your favorite streaming platform is? We've all got an addiction. It's in there. Find it. That's our question. Write it down in a notebook that no one's ever going to see, in a password-protected file. Throw away the password, except for you're the only one who can remember it, so that 20 years from now, as you've done this each year, you can see what you have admitted to yourself. Because if 20 years from now, if my addiction is X, and 20 years from now it's X, and every year it was X, then I haven't done the second part, which is, well, if I have had the wisdom to admit that I am being oppressed by something, why am I not trying to get out of Egypt? Which is then that second part of this. And that is, what are we going to do about it? Are we willing to admit it to ourselves? Are we willing to admit it to others? Anonymously, in a 12-step program. Are we going to go to a therapist? Are we going to go to a pastoral counselor? Are we going to go to the person who we trust most in the world with our deepest, darkest secrets and begin the conversations to, at the very least, bring this to mind? And before we stop at addiction, there's another aspect to this, because this is about oppression. And the symbol of oppression in this story is Pharaoh. Pharaoh being the person who knew that he was right no matter what. The hardening of his heart was his narrative reality at the time. That's the meaning of, and the eternal harden his heart. It's not a cruel text of, oh, let's make sure that the Pharaoh does exactly what God wants, an anthropomorphic bearded dude in the sky wanted him to do, so that he can have his firstborn killed. The eternal hardening his heart is a statement of the reality of the nature and narrative of Pharaoh. He thought he was God. All of his people thought he was God. Therefore, he did not question his assumptions. He did not question his actions. He did not question his ideas. That is part of what oppression is. And beyond addiction, we also have this idea of ideology. And the reason this needs to be brought up as part of the iterative process is this is also how we refuse to evolve, how we refuse to move forward. If we have non-falsifiable ideas, which means that no one can tell me I'm wrong about this. I'm not talking about scientific stuff. I'm talking about the soft sciences. I'm talking about our politics. I'm talking about our religious ideas and philosophies and interpretations. If we have anything that no one can tell us something that will cause us to change our minds, if our ideas are non-falsifiable, then we're not Moses helping to lead people out of Egypt. We are Pharaoh. We are the oppressor. And the sad thing about being in thrall of an ideology is the very act of being in thrall of an ideology means that we don't see it as an ideology. We just see it as rightness. And if we're unable in this moment to ask the question, is there anything in me that is non-falsifiable? Is there anything that I believe that if someone challenged me with contradictory facts or contradictory ideas that it wouldn't matter? That's an ideology. And the scary thing about ideologies is they usually have some sort of utopian vision. They usually have something that it's supposed to lead to. It's kind of like my underpants gnomes video from earlier, right? Step 1, steal underpants. Step 2, step 3, big money. Well, ideologies have the same thing. Step 1, believe in this thing that is absolutely right. Step 2. Step 3, we have a utopia. The only problem is, in step 2, there's a lot of pharaohs throughout time that we can actually view, because Stalin had an ideology, Mao had an ideology, Hitler had an ideology, Pol Pot had an ideology. Step 1 was have the ideology. Step 3 was 1,000-year Reich. Step 3 was the communist paradise. Step 2 was, oh, there were a lot of people who didn't practice it in exactly the way the ideology said, and what happened to them? I'm not saying that every ideology leads to atrocity. I'm saying that ideology is required for atrocity to eventually happen, because what do you do with those pesky people who won't involve themselves in step 1? What happens when I profoundly disagree with you and your ideology? And so the other part of this iterative process is to take that risk and say, am I part of something that's non-falsifiable? Have I given my energy, have I given my narrative over to someone else's narrative? That is the lens through which I see everything, and if anyone contradicts it, they are in the wrong, and I've got a reason for why they are wrong. That is ideology. It's no different than fundamentalism, and it's the other aspect of behold, Dorvador. How do we recognize when we even need to come out of Egypt? How do we recognize when we are Egypt? And with that, it's time to start getting ready for Passover. We're only a few days away when I post this, so hopefully the cleaning has already started. But with that, I want to thank you all for being a part of Beit Virtuali. Let's go ahead and look in the mirror of Torah this Passover. Look in the mirror of our Magid, of the Haggadah, our telling ourselves. Let's be aware of our narratives, what they're doing to us and to each other. And by being able to name these things, let's then turn the narrative to how we are, through awareness, overcoming. Take care, everyone. Chag Semeyach. We'll see you next time.
Eloheinu romemu Adonai